addressed this subject for over 20 years, Michael Hennessy emphasizes the necessity of developing tactics and techniques for maneuvering safely through the unexpected and, as you all know, the unpredictable. His academic credentials include advanced degrees in psychology, focusing on anxiety, and he's addressed Fortune 500 companies as well as state and local associations. His business experience includes a psychologist position, implementing federal Title I programs in Denver and the school system for 10 years, real estate brokerage sales and management for 15 years, and current affiliation with Valentine Mortgage in Newport Beach, providing real estate financing in Orange County. He holds affiliate membership in the National Speakers Association in Phoenix and the Mortgage Bankers Association in Washington, D.C. We thought this was an extremely timely subject, suggested people bring their best friends, business partners, spouses, whatever, to talk about job hunting, stress, and surviving. So please do welcome with me, Michael Hennessy.
Good. I think so. What Kathleen failed to mention to you is when she mentioned the positive things in the background, she failed to mention is that half of the time since I've been in California, which has been about 6 years, almost to the date, I've been unemployed. And recently I had the opportunity to attend a conference in San Diego to reinforce some information that I had heard, and that the #1 cause of heart disease in the Western industrial world is not all of the antecedent causes that we had previously identified. They contribute, but they're not the cause. The #1 cause of heart disease, which, as you know, is still the prime killer, is job dissatisfaction. Job dissatisfaction. So it might interestingly then follow that if someone is in a career where they're happy and functioning, that they might be able to either put off or avoid heart disease. However, if they're unemployed, that means they're going to live forever. Now, those of us that are unemployed and are going to be living together forever, the question is, what do we do in that little period of time? And that forever can sometimes be an interesting little period of time, and I have had some time there, and I'm sure that you either have some time there, or going to have some time there, the way things shift, or you will have some time there. So what's significant tonight is not the skills of attaining employment, not how to interview. That's what the Jennings Company is for. That's what these search people are for. What I'd like to share with you is some thoughts on what do you do during the unknown. What do you do when things aren't working? I used to go into audiences years ago when I was a little bit more on a circuit than I am now, a little bit more employed. And I would tell people that if everything is going right, if your relationships are fine, your kids are all getting through college, you're paying your taxes, and life is fine, you don't need my talk. And if you don't need my talk, everything is refunded and all bets are off. In fact, I'll double your bets. Nobody would ever leave, because our lives somehow have those little twists of fate where things don't go right. Now, what happens when things don't go right? What happens when your expectations, if you will, are not falling into line with the kinds of things that you would like to have happen? Some 20 years ago, the buzzword was stress. I like to replace that with the idea of discrepancy. I think discrepancy makes a little more sense. We can get through stress. We can get through things, big things that happen. We get through deaths. We get through job changes. We get through this. We get through that. What happens in life when things are basically discrepant? What happens when things aren't going according to our expectations? What do you do? How do you feel? And how do you deal with it? Because much of our lives are filled with these kinds of moments. And therefore, what becomes significant is what happens during those moments, and even more significantly, what you do during those moments, because that entirely determines the outcome. Some 2,000 years ago, nestled in the cradle of Western philosophy, there lived a little-known ex-Greek slave by the name of Epictetus, who made a statement that I'd like to quote for you. This gentleman gave it to me a little earlier today. And what he said is that men are not disturbed by things, but rather by their appearance. And the most important thing I can share with you tonight is it is not the stress, but the way in which you react to it that becomes significant. Once again, it is not the stress or what happens to you, but the way in which you react to it becomes significant. We all know people that tend to go through life somewhat unassailed. We also know people that tend to fall apart when things start going wrong, even the slightest things. And we're all a little bit of both. But what becomes significant, what might we look at, and what are some of the dynamics involved in ways to set up a style, if you will, of dealing with pressure, stress, or discrepancy? I remember coming down here from San Francisco and arriving in Orange County and having a wonderful relationship with a significant other and announcing to her that here I am. She said, "That's nice. Where do you work?" I said, "Well, I'm unemployed." Give me a funnier look, but it didn't seem to bother you when you'd visit me in San Francisco. And I said, "Well, if I'm unemployed, you'll still love me, won't you?" She said, "Yeah, I'll love you, and I'll miss you too." I'd like to quote you something from an article that I had written a few years back about the idea of change and get a little idea of the perspective. In the 1980s, most of us learned that we had to run faster just to stand still. And now, after a decade of car and portable phones as well as fax machines, upwardly mobile materialism, health club memberships, and information overload, some of us are taking a hard look at where we are and how we got there. The 1990s have ushered in an acute feeling of imbalance. Television prime time is out. Personal quality time is in. Now more than ever, people are getting to suspect that there is more to developing the human potential than career advancement and 5% body fat. When our parents were born, people took trains, not planes. They didn't trust cars or roads or long trips. There were no elevators, fax machines, computers, or cellular phones. Nobody ever heard of cholesterol, crack, junk bonds, poison pills, nuclear energy, not to mention subatomic particles. Tax rules were understandable. Things started to speed up. The world sped up. Scientific discoveries multiplied. Finance and money management became everyone's #1 priority. We jogged, walked, even stopped eating many of the foods we loved. We removed salt, took alcohol from beer and wine, polyunsaturated some foods, introduced fake fats, safe sex, virtual realities, robbed the caffeine from coffee, purified the water, became sugar-free and enlightened, all with one fell swoop of the social musician's wand. We learned how to stand. We learned how to change and stand for computers, program VCRs. We discovered ourselves drowning in a flood of information. It became almost impossible to find enough time to become well informed. We changed political parties, spouses, and careers one evening and realized that we live in a culture hypnotized by the illusion of time, in which the so-called present moment is felt as nothing but a hairline between an all-powerful past and an absorbingly important future. So things are moving quickly. Things are constantly changing. How do you stay into that mainstream, and how do you keep that balance, and how do you keep those stress hormones in a level position? Use an example of, do a visual with me. If you're coming down from a meeting and you're coming down on an elevator and you're the last one in the elevator and you get about halfway down and all of a sudden you feel this jabbing and this impingement in your back, what would be your first reaction? What would be your thought? How do you feel? Feel a sort of sense of anger, perhaps a sense of discomfort. You can just kind of feel your blood pressure going up. Let's say you turn around and you find out that this person is blind and that they're trying to find their way out of the elevator because they're not sure what floor they're on and they're pushing with their cane. Now how do you feel? Maybe you feel a sort of a sense of compassion, like you'd like to assist them, you'd like to help them out. Isn't it interesting? You can just almost feel your blood pressure come down. Now it's the same event, the exact same event to which we ascribe meaning, to which we saw a different way, and that made all the difference in the world. If you go over here to Disneyland and you take a trip on Magic Mountain and you enjoy the ride and you feel somewhat exhilarated and you get through and you hook yourself up to a biofeedback machine or you get some technical tests, you'll find that your body has produced a whole series of very, very positive kinds of chemicals. If, on the other hand, you're terrified during that same ride, you'll find that it's produced an element called cortisol, which is a destruction and a breakdown of the immune system. And isn't it interesting how that same activity had such a dramatic shift and change? So what I'm suggesting to you is not an answer as such, but an awareness that if you can develop a style of looking at something during that period of time, it'll make all the difference in the world in how you react to it and what your physical energy and strength becomes and how it will lead you to your next success. Speaking to an American bankers group one time many, many years ago, it was announced that the vice president of the Bank of America's wife's credit card was stolen during the conference, and he beseeched them not to go ahead and report it because he knew that the thief would use it less than she did. Things tend to generally work out. I had an opportunity to flirt with the possibility of being without a place to live at one point, and the worst thing I remember is I ended up living over in De Anza Harbor on a 46-foot boat. Went over there for a dinner one evening with a friend of mine from Colorado, who then it's a big 2-bedroom boat, and he says, if you'd like to stay a little while, let me know. Well, eight months later, I moved off. And I remember sitting in that back bay watching Herman the Heron stalk his fish, you know, and or stalk his dinner, and watching the hummingbirds sort of, or the sandpipers sort of fly in formation with a little opera in the background and some Colombian coffee, deciding if I wanted to jog or swim that day. And it wasn't the worst thing that ever happened. But it was kind of stayed in that moment and making the most of it. Schopenhauer used to say that the purpose of life is amor fati, love of your fate. And it's kind of like being in whatever situation you are, blooming where you're planted, and finding out that whatever it is, there's something there to be relished. I ended up finding perhaps one of the most significant people in my life when I was unemployed and living on a yacht, and it worked out fine for me. I would encourage you to stay unemployed. Although I remember going to San Francisco one time, the first time I ever went to an unemployment office, because being an independent contractor, I could never collect unemployment. I sold some franchises for Prudential. I came out here, and so I qualified for unemployment, and I walked into the unemployment office in Marin County, which is almost a contradiction in terms. Marin County is the highest income per capita on the planet, I think. And this fellow drove up next to me, and he had this big dog and a Porsche, and he was all tan and curly-haired, and he had a tennis racket, and I'm kind of stuttering in there like a country bumpkin. He says, first time here? I says, yeah. He says, there's the forms you fill out, and here's the line. He says, best job you'll ever have. Avoid fear, worry, energy usage in relation to events outside of your control. Stress is an energy shift. It's a change in the way we use energy biologically. And it's very, very valuable in short periods of time. But over a protracted period of time, it compromises your health, your productivity, your ability to find alternatives and continue to be successful. So look at that. Think long term. Stay calm during the unknown. The absolute major message. There's a whole lot of literature out in the areas of psychiatry and spiritual growth and the rest of it that is dealing now with holding the tension of the opposites, And I'm going to steal some of their thunder and apply it here, because it may not be the tension of the opposites, but I think the same response is required. And what they're looking at is taking this whole idea of contradiction, or things that seem intolerable, and granting them, each of them, the contradictory parts, a certain amount of positive energy, letting them caramelize into a paradox, and then just staying with that paradox and seeing what shows up. And when you first read this, it sounds a little ivory tower-ish and the rest of it, but I'm going to borrow some of their thunder and introduce that thought and invite you to take a look at it in relation to this technique as well, because sometimes things seem really out of whack and out of balance and contradictory, and perhaps what they're really doing is setting up the next period of growth. I remember Chesterton used to describe a paradox as a truth standing on its head waiting to be recognized. So sometimes that'll work for you as well as seemingly against you. And finally, on the top, function within your own tolerance level. I've got a whole session that I used to do on, when time permits, on stress tolerance level. It's very important the way in which you identify where that is. Some people can take a lot more stress than others. And it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just finding what that level is and operating within it. It's an area where you'll function with the greatest degree of productivity and certainty. So what I'd like to do is just close with a thought. Anybody have an opportunity to read this bestseller that's on about longevity, Deepak Chopra's work, Ageless Mind, Timeless Body? There's a little way that he ends this, which I think is interesting, and he says, we all intuitively want to get rid of discomfort. It takes satisfying answers about who we are and where we're going to bring the inner discontent to an end. It's life's true nature. Life's comfortable, safe, unenforced, and intuitively correct. Learning to accept your life not as a series of random events, but as a path of awakening whose purpose is maximum joy and fulfillment. So with that thought in mind, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address your group. I'd like to encourage you in whatever areas you're following, and also hope for strength in the unknown, because I think that that's basically the key to the 90s and the rest of our lives. Thank you. Okay. Make sure they're ones I know the answer to.
If not, I probably will.
Okay. All questions that I don't know the answer to, Kathleen will take them.
Japanese have a word that kind of condenses what you have been saying this evening. The word is called muga, which is enjoying the moment with all of one's senses in just that moment. The tool you've used tonight, helping us here with our hearts and our minds, one of those tools was the use of humor. Can you share with us the benefit of trying to find humor and using it as a friend and a tool to get through some of these paths that may not, shall we say, be all that smooth?
You're the first one that's used that term muga. Yeah, the first time I heard that word, it's the way the Japanese, it's the space they take when they're enjoying their tea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting term. Humor is, I think, very significant. I mean, if you look, the first example that comes to mind is, anyone read Man's Search for Meaning, the Viktor Frankl work? I don't want to get off on an academic tangent. I want to hitchhike on your point. Humor is very valuable from a biochemical standpoint. I had an opportunity to meet Norman Cousins before he died in San Francisco, and he's the one, as you know, who had that connective tissue disorder, and that he had 6 weeks to live, and 10 years later he died because he checked into a hotel and got himself a bunch of VCRs of Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello, and he figured that if the mind can do certain things, why can't it then secrete the same type of corresponding chemistry, only in a salutary sense? So it's an obvious thing that humor, and a sense of humor, looking at a sense of the ridiculous, having a way of taking the same situation and seeing something humorous, if you will. I don't think it's a mockery. I think it's a way to really see a sense of the ridiculous in it, and really kind of tune into the human condition, whatever that might be. But what comes to mind in Viktor Frankl's works is that he was in a concentration camp for a number of years, and what he discovered is that the people that survived had two things in common. They had a sense of humor and a sense of purpose. They had an ability to take a look at the atrocities of their life and somehow see some humor in it. And I think that I don't know what to say other than the fact that I agree with you 100%, and I think that the body agrees with us. And hitchhiking on the word muga, that really also translates into being in the moment. And if you look at some of the ancient cultures, and even some of the things that are going on in holistic medicine, it's finding a way to stay calm during those periods of time, which becomes imperative in maintaining that body balance. I mean, stress can be very, very valuable. When you want to go argue with the IRS, You know, a few of those, I mean, stresses, it's extremely valuable ally in short doses.
Is there really evidence that life is more stressful than exercise?
I'd rather be unemployed than facing bubonic plague in the 13th century. So, I mean, I think there's always been issues. There's been issues of man's survival based on things that we take for granted. Sanitation, for instance. I mean, the spectrum of the lifetime of the species of a human being is 120 years. And part of the disruption of that has to do with a simple thing like up until the 14th or 15th century of sanitation. Hitchhiking on your point, I don't think that these times in some ways, if you look at the big picture of it, are any more stressful than other times. I mean, having an unsavory, salivating, saber-toothed tiger at my door wanting me for dinner sometime, or trying to put up with my mother-in-law as a caveman, I think would probably shoot about as much adrenaline as getting laid off. But I think what's going on here is that it's more constant, it's more cumulative. It's more constant, it's more cumulative than it was in the past. A caveman could go out and go through all of his problems and hunt, and then he'd come back for 6 months and he didn't have to go through any more until he ran out of food. I mean, I'm being facetious, but I think that's the issue. There's been a lot of articles that have dealt with it. I looked into that years ago, wondering that same thing. You get into studies where the stress that's done in rural communities, the stress that's experienced in rural communities is just as stressful as in urban communities. Well, probably it. Probably it. So, my only comment on it, I mean, yours was a statement and it was also a question. I think that there's always been stress. I think it's part of the human condition. I think it shows up in different ways. You know, the saber-toothed tigers now are phone calls and bills from American Express and things like this. But in the big picture, probably the same. I think the difference is the rapidity and the cumulative nature of it.